Today's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is brought to you by StarCityGames.com, who, longtime listeners will know, has a new sale every week over at StarCityGames.com/sale. And this week, until Monday, August the 2nd at 10:59 a.m. Eastern Time, you can earn bonus bucks. It's store credit, but we're calling it bonus bucks, and this is how it works. You make a purchase in US dollars on the website, you get 10% of that back on your account in store credit. And normally this is where I'd scroll down the page and read off some examples, but this time it's on everything. So treat yourself to something nice, get 10% of that back, and use that to treat yourself next week when the new sale drops at StarCityGames.com/sale.
This week's Dominaria's Judgment is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel, the #1 store for Magic the Gathering inspired apparel. Take a look at their t-shirts, hoodies, stickers, and just general stylings at coalesceapparel.shop. Then use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10% on your entire order. And seriously, I want to emphasize that sticker part. Shirts are cool, but you can send a targeted message with the sticker. Slap it on your deck box if it matches your commander, or if you really want to get inventive, find a way to slap the 3x4 sticker on your 2.5x3.5 Magic card, maybe with a sleeve, maybe with a hard case. You're inventive people, you'll find a way to make it work. So, take a look at coalesceapparel.shop, check out their product lines like Wooburg Forever and Ravnica University, and see what catches your eye. Remember, use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10%. Coalesce Apparel and Design. No one made what they wanted, so they made it themselves. If you are looking to sell your Magic the Gathering cards, it's never been easier than with StarCityGames.com. Make the best of our 30% store credit bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry when you use any of our 4 simple ways to sell located at StarCityGames.com/sell. You can check out our buy list, box up your cards and send them our way with the ship and sell program. Come on into the Star City Game Center in Roanoke, Virginia for that personal touch. Or if you have everything, 500,000 cards, you want to store and you want to do some bulk, we'll come to you. And seriously, when we're talking about these large collections, Star City does mean they will come to you. The list of places goes from Ohio to New Jersey and elsewhere. Like, seriously, I've driven from Ohio to New Jersey. That is not a short drive. So head on over to starcitygames.com/sell, that's SELL, for more details on all these great options, and maybe clear up a little space in your life for your next project, even if that happens to just be even more Magic cards or another Commander deck.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 16 of Dominaria's Judgment, a weekly modern podcast brought to you by StarCityGames.com. I'm Dom Harvey. I'm here with Ari Lax, and our son, our preview card, Murktide Regent, he's all grown up. He's making his way out in the big wide world, and I'm so proud of him, Ari.
Yeah, this I had like medium expectations of the card, and somehow it's blown those all away. It turns out that Tombstalker, but bigger, is just like a really good card.
In the color that's even better at fueling it as well and protecting it and so on and so forth. But I always had faith in Murktide Regent to deliver, and you know, it shows that just putting your faith in them can go a long way. And we will have someone who got great success by putting his faith in Murktide Regent, Milan Bayana, who innovated a lot of the current crop of is it Murktide Regent decks in Modern, here in with us for our main segment to go for a deep dive on that deck. But we do have a big batch of Modern results to get to first at the top here. So we had the Mana Traders series over the weekend. We had the Saturday and Sunday challenges as normal. And we also had a gigantic super PTQ on the Sunday. So a ton of results to dive into here, and not too much new, I guess. I think it's mostly confirming what we knew and or suspected already.
Yeah, it's a lot of good decks, and even the decks that are not, you know, the obvious top tier ones are kind of still focused around the same very good cards.
Yeah, so the Saturday challenge, we had a Murktide Mirror in the finals, so validating a timely choice for an episode topic here. The other thing that stood out to me from those results is there was a ton of Living End, specifically the build with Grief and a heavier focus on black cards to support that. And it seems like that is both the default Cascade deck at this point in Modern, and also the default build, of that Cascade deck.
Yeah, there's still some Rhinos going around, but I think that deck has a significantly harder time with Colossus Hammer than the Living End deck. Making 2/8/8s is less power than a single hammer, and often less power than a single construct. So that's kind of dicey, whereas Living End actually does something. Also, a lot of decks have turned to Endurance as their graveyard hate, and Living End, like the lineup between Endurance and Grief is really awkward for Endurance.
Yeah, there's never really a good point where you get to tag everything at the same time without giving them a grief when they go for the eventual Living End there. On the topic of the Footfalls decks, there was a list from the Sunday PTQ, I want to say, championed by Doomwake, Devin O'Donnell, who we had on the show discussing the Asmore decks in what feels like an eternity ago by now. And so this was a build with main deck Prismari Command, which obviously great against Hammer Time, dealing with Colossus Hammer and these gigantic constructs that are putting your Rhino to shame, but then also doing things like tagging Chalice of the Void, which at this point is maybe the most popular sideboard card, or even main deck card in some spots in Modern, as a way, or almost a universal answer of dealing with these Cascade decks. So lines up quite nicely there. Also can just give you further redundancy on that cheap removal for small creatures, and then just the filtering effect is good there. Sometimes just you're drawing to, discarding to, getting you towards that Cascade spell is what you want to do, and even just making you treasure. It's weird in a deck which wants to get to exactly 3 mana every game for its Cascade spells and most of its interaction. That's where its curve is compressed on both ends. But even having that treasure token can jump you up to 5 mana for Fury, which was the other big innovation in this build, where thanks to Prismari Command joining Violent Outburst and Fire Ice and so on, you now finally have enough red cards to support that card in the main deck. And if you think the format is going to be fairly creature heavy, a lot of small creatures that you can pick off, Fury is fantastic in those spots. And in the sideboard of some of these lists, we see Firespout as another card which pitches to your red pitch spells and your green pitch spells, but also can act as a sweeper that leaves your Rhinos around to survive, and then sometimes you can cast it just for green to pick off flyers and leave all your stuff lying around. So a few innovations here in what is mostly an established archetype by this point.
Yeah, I think the biggest innovation is just cutting Cryptic Command. One of the other things that kind of was lurking around the low ball side of this weekend was Wafo Tapa still out there fighting the good Esper fight with all of his Timeless Dragons. But even he's trimming down on Cryptic Commands in his Esper piles. Like, the format is becoming more and more and more about 1 and 2 mana spells, and you just cannot exchange Cryptic Command for those. This is like, if you go back to 2018 Modern, how many Cryptics were in these decks?
Right. It's like the decks that Cryptic Command is meant to be best against have been forced out of the format by these super low curve aggro and combo decks, or aggro combo decks in some cases. And I guess it does have some utility there in terms of if your Rhinos are bricked on the ground by just a gigantic thing wearing a hammer or whatever it is, you can buy at least one attack that way or swing a race in your favor. So the card does have a lot of versatility, and I think that's what draws people in and traps them there a lot of the time, where this card always does something, right? But you have to really be honest with yourself about whether that's a thing you actually care about doing, and if this is a fine rate to be paying for it.
Yeah, I think the rate is the issue, because you can always convince yourself the exchange is good. You always end up a card or whatever, but like sometimes they just make another 2 plays that turn just like, oh, well, none of this even mattered.
Mm-hmm. So staying on that Sunday PTQ for a second, we had 3 copies of this Grixis Lurus deck in the top 8. So this is a familiar cast of characters from these Rakdos Ragavan decks. So you have Ragavan, DRC, a lot of the cheap removal there, Unholy Heat, Lurus, so on and so forth. But then the blue cards give you Snapcaster Mage, which is fantastic both with Lurus and just in general in these grindy mirror matches, and Expressive Iteration, really doing a lot of work there too, alongside stuff like Drown in the Lock, where one big issue with these decks sometimes is you have a lot of specific types of interactions. So a pile of Lightning Bolts and Unholy Heats for creatures, or a bunch of discard spells to break up the opponent's draw, but sometimes they just draw a thing on turn 3 or 4 that doesn't line up well against that, and you're kind of left defenseless. So having Drown means you get into these mid-game positions where you just have a mortal lock on the game now, because you have your threat, you have your Drown, and there's not much they can do to get back in the game anymore.
Yeah, the other blue card of note I want to talk about is Seal of Removal. This deck, the Lurus the Dream Den is so important to this deck, and while you do have Kolaghan's Command to loop it, the Seal of Removal plus Lurus setup is just so hard to break up.
Yeah, it's a soft lock of sorts in itself against these creature decks that don't have that much interaction. So Hammer, Infect, stuff like that. But then also, if you have the seal deployed in advance, it acts as a shield, if you like, for your Lurrus. And at that point, eventually you will stick the Lurrus through their removal spells and start buying back the seal or start buying back other stuff. And just establishing that inevitability with Lurrus is basically all you need to do in these longer games.
Yeah, Lurrus, this is probably one of the better Lurrus decks I've seen, just because of the nature of the discard spells and Drawn on the Luck extending the games. Whereas the Rakdos deck, you're actually like more interested in killing your opponent because you don't have protection against the top deck of anything. Drown just lets you, and Expressive Iteration as well, just giving you cardboard. You can just go deep into a game and just cast a Lurrus, and who cares what else is going on.
Yeah, we also mentioned the positioning of these 4-color Indomitable Creativity shells, and neither of us was a fan of Valimachus, but we mentioned Emrakul as if not a transformational approach for these decks. You would often see one Emrakul in the sideboard for when that seemed like a more resilient threat, and so that leads to the obvious question of why not just make that the focus of the deck, not have to play a bunch of save the moments and time warps and so on, and open up even more slots for early interaction. And that's the approach we saw with the second Creativity deck in the top 8 here, and this feels like the natural endpoint of a lot of the kind of big picture stuff that we've spoken about in the past few weeks.
Yeah, I'm interested to see if it can. We see Emrakul here with Creativity. I'm wondering if we end up seeing a even further turn back towards like more Emrakuls and Through the Breach, because those two shells, this is what we saw before Modern Horizons 2, and I'm wondering if there's value in kind of going down both of those roads again, even though this is kind of layering with Transmogrify on top of the creativities.
And I do like that approach too, where often finding the creativity and resolving it was the big sticking point for this deck. And you would run into these ad nauseum-esque situations almost sometimes where your deck was well positioned in the matchup, and your plan of, I'm going to beat the turn 4 combo deck, they didn't really have many ways to interact with that, but that question never arose because you just didn't find your creativity and you were spinning your tires doing a whole lot of nothing. And so just having redundancy on that central combo piece, I think is really crucial there.
Yeah, I haven't thought through the implications of the colors, but Polymorph is also a card. So there might be some thought to put into like forking your colors if people start going to Ether Gust or whatever to answer your big spell.
Yeah, I think the issue there is you're already a 4 Dwarfenmine deck, so that biases you pretty heavily towards red, and by the time you get to turn 4, you're almost always going to have a blue source, so that's not such a big deal. I think the bigger issue there is Mystical Dispute, where against any of these similar decks trying to do the same thing, getting your big payoff card disputed is just such a backbreaking line.
That's fair. That might be the more important color hate card. Also, just like having double blue, I guess with 5 mana, it's probably going to happen, but it's not 100% certain. And these like turns where you go hard evidence into Transmogrify or Polymorph might stretch that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm still not fully convinced by the Remand in this deck, and that card is quite heavily polarized in this format right now, where against some of these decks, it is just laughably bad. These decks with super low curves where you're remanding a 1-drop and they just get to instantly recast it again, and you haven't got anywhere, versus, mirrors or mirrors of sorts, or decks trying to do a similar thing where, Remand is a legitimately good card, and then also the Cascade decks where getting to Remand the Footfalls or the Living End is a fantastic option to have. And so maybe you accept that. Maybe you accept this is going to be my best card against some portion of the field, my worst card against others, and I'm just going to make sure my sideboard mapping works so that I can take these out of my deck as the first thing I do as soon as we get to game 2 there.
Yeah, I do wonder if I know Zan Syed had delay last week, and I don't want a large number of delays, but maybe a small number, especially with the Teferi synergy, might be better than all of the remands.
I could see that. Yeah, if you decide you want some kind of stack-based interaction at 2 mana, but the mana for counterspell absolutely does not work, so we don't even need to go there. And you could try just like a good old school mana leak, but then that runs into the same issues against these low curve decks in these longer games where they get to 4 mana on their turn 4 and they get to resolve that hammer through your counterspell. So I think delay might be a smart choice there, but I love a lot of what the shell is doing. Not just the 4 copies of Hard Evidence, which automatically was going to hook me in, and I was going to have love goggles on here, but getting to have 4 Prismatic Ending, 4 Lightning Bolt, 4 Prismari Command, alongside Teferi Time Raveler, Wrenn and 6. That is such a kind of a layered mix of interaction, which is really hard for any of these small creature decks to punch through. And then in the sideboard, we have a lot of nods to the decks that get to dodge around that. So Flusterstorm, I think, is worth highlighting here as a card which normally we see Chalice of the Void as the go-to against the Cascade decks. That is not really an option here because that interferes with your own indomitable creativities. And Flusterstorm has some advantages anyway, in terms of if you expect them to have a bunch of stuff like Force of Vigor, Foundation Breaker, whatever it is, ways to deal with your Chalice, Flusterstorm is a way to interfere with their Cascade spell on the stack, where, let's say they cast Charlotte's Agent into Crashing Footfalls, you cast Flusterstorm, they now have to pay an additional 3 mana for that, which is much easier said than done. And let's say they're doing it on your turn, so maybe they have Force of Negation backup, or they have a mana up for their own Mystical Dispute or something. You basically win all of those counter wars by default. So if you're looking for a defensive measure for your blue deck to go up against the Cascade strategies, I think Flusterstorm is a good option there.
Yeah, that second interaction is the really important one, because that's the actual broken thing these Cascade decks do, is being able to go off on your turn and use Force of Negation as protection. I mean, I guess the Cascade is broken in general, but that's like the really broken thing they do. And Force of Negation Flusterstorm just shutting that Force of Negation down, that's a big, big game changer in that exact interaction.
And then beyond that, we have 2 copies of Wear Tear in the sideboard, presumably as another nod to Hammer and so on. And then joining Flusterstorm, we have 3 Mystical Dispute and 2 copies of Veil of Summer. And Veil is a card that I played the 4-color Bring to Light deck in this PTQ, and I was very impressed with Veil of Summer across the day, where against the Rakdos decks and also against the Izzet Murktide Regent decks, this is just such a great way to set up a turn where you punch through their one piece of interaction and end up with a crushing advantage.
Yeah, Veil of Summer's messed up. Welcome to Magic 2020, as I feel like I say every week or two. It's easy to forget that for a long period of, I don't want to say long, but for a decent period of time in Modern, people stopped playing Veil because everyone could not play a deck that lost to Veil. And that was every deck trying to play a blue or black spell targeting things, with the exception of like Uro, because whatever, Uro.
Yeah, it really became a victim of its own success in that regard. And even if you banned those decks from playing Veil altogether, your Thoughtseize Inquisition deck was not going to get through Wrenn and 6 and Uro and Omnath and Field of the Dead and God knows what else you could get to play all in that one mess of a package.
Yeah, that was a time.
I feel like one of these days, when it's a slow news week, I'll just let you go on an extended rant for 40 minutes about how people don't appreciate how messed up Magic 2020 was just as a set. Smack bang in the middle of the Throne of Eldraine, War of the Spark, Modern Horizons, Ikoria era. It's like, this is the one set that always gets lumped in as kind of a footnote to that, when in reality, this is one of the main offenders in there.
The problem really is just Throne is so much worse. But like, I think if Throne didn't Magic 2020 was the most messed up set until the next set. That's really how that was going.
Which you could also say about basically every set from that time frame. Yeah. So I like a lot of what this deck is doing. Probably my front runner at this point for this coming weekend's events. The one question I keep coming back to here is the land count, where we have 24 lands, of which 4 of these are Dwarven Mind, which is really not what you want to have as part of your early game sequencing at any point. And then you need to have the one basic island, let's say, to go with your fetch lands, but then sometimes you draw that and your Dwarven Minds become just unplayable for a long time, and you are trying to balance these 4 different colors all at the same time. So yeah, you have Wrenn and 6, and yeah, your curve stops at the 4 mana mark, and you have some filtering and so on, but it feels like you will lose a decent number of games to where you just can't cast your spells on time because you have too many tap lands, or not enough lands, or some aspect of this mana base, which it seems like is easily avoidable.
I think you might be able to eat into, you can eat into your interaction a little. The problem is that just the way Wrenn works, where like the Scapeshift deck wants to hit all its lands. It has Valakut, it has Dryad, whatever. These decks, like, I don't really know what you're doing with all of this extra mana. You don't have a ton of card draw power, and you end up in spots where, like, if you have a Ren going, drawing lands is, like, actively terrible.
Yeah, it's this weird dichotomy where either you have Ren going and all of your land needs are answered for the rest of the game, or you don't have Ren and you're having to make your land draws naturally, and suddenly there's, taking some shortcuts there really comes back to bite you. So it's hard to hedge for both of those scenarios at once, but I feel like more often when you have an uncontested Ren, you're going to be in a decent spot regardless, and sometimes one of those lands is a Triome, and so you're just like drawing an extra card each turn, or you're getting all of your Dwarven Binds out of your deck, and you're creating your own little army on the battlefield that way. So it feels like hedging for the screw scenario over the flood scenario may be more wise, but this is the stock land count at this point. It's every one of these decks has 24, maybe 25 land, and so maybe I'm just being a little too fearful there.
You're allowed to mulligan whenever you want.
You are, but I feel like if the rest of your hand has a lot going for it, you don't want to be priced into mulliganing just because, you've set this issue up for yourself.
If you mulligan into a Ren and 6, like, that's basically not a mulligan, right? So I think this deck has ways around that. But the only thing I have to say is maybe you could have... I think if you had, like, one more land, you could convince yourself that if you drew all your lands, you could get 2 treasures and cast an Emrakul, but I don't think that's really something that matters.
Yeah, that's not happening. We don't need to worry about that one. But jumping down here from the top 8 into 10th place, we have the 4-color Bring to Light deck in the hands of Medvedev. And it is easy to craft narratives around these tournaments where you see BMJ, noted Moto grinder Ben Jones, sneaking into 8th place with a Heliod deck. And so we could very easily come in here and say, look, we were right. Heliod is a player in the format once again, cracking into the top 8 of this Super BTQ. But in reality, the X and 2s go from 8th place all the way down to 20-something and replace the Heliod deck with anything else, and you're making that argument instead. So we're always good to take these results with a note of caution. But this 4-color Bring to Light deck, I know both of us were very high on it, recommended it as our pick for this previous weekend in the What We Play, and you, in your column this week, wrote about the various different implementations of this Ren and 6 Teferi Time Raveler Shell, which has more than you might think under that broad umbrella here.
Yeah, it's just like a really, the Ren and 6 extending your land count in a lot of ways, and just like Teferi being a really powerful hate card. And them just both sort of covering for each other, where Ren picks off the small ball stuff and Teferi bounces the big stuff. Like, it just kind of works out. Also, like, Ren wanting fetches, and then the Triomes, like, red-green is kind of there's not like a red-green mana base in this format, so like you already want to go to a 3rd color, and then you're fixing, and you may as well just have a 4th color. It all just kind of works out once you get those 2 cards in the mix.
Yeah, and the Triomes bridge the gap there so perfectly, where once you're in 3 colors, depending on what that color combination is, like if you're in Bant, you don't have a Triome, so either way, whether you go for Ketria Triome or Valgrind Triome, you're kind of opening up that 4th color by the back door anyway. And so from there, as you say, it's a fairly small step to just embrace that 4th color entirely. And even if you are in, Jeskai, let's say, or Temur, once you accommodate the mana base so you have enough fetch lands for Ren and 6, and you have your 1 Triome, like, it's so easy to convince yourself that, well, I'll just add the other Triome, and then I have, 12, 13 sources of this 4th color already, and at that point, why not play Teferi or Prismatic Ending or such and such? But the way I came to this deck was Chalice of the Void seems like it's a fantastic card in the format right now, and I want to find the best home for Chalice, and it seemed like this would be that candidate. And then over the course of the tournament, what I found was Chalice was, as good as advertised against the Cascade decks, obviously, but then against the, let's say, the Ragavan decks or the DRC decks, where you would expect it to be one of your more powerful cards, I found that, especially on the draw, it was just not that reliable, and I didn't even want to draw it a lot of the time. And if I did draw it, I was opening up some unnecessary vulnerability to either stuff that they had anyway, like Colligan's Command or Prismatic Ending in the case of the Rakdos decks, or just cards which they felt priced into bringing in to answer my chalices, and then I'm making those cards live instead of dead. And And I just wanted to play my ordinary game against them because I felt favored if that was happening. And so if it wasn't good there, and it also was a little too slow most of the time against the hammer decks as well, at that point it's only for the Cascade decks. And so you start thinking, well, why not just sideboard this card for those matchups, add some more copies of Teferi in the main deck, which does double duty there, but also is good across the board elsewhere. And I think this is a fairly common pattern that you see where you're drawn to a deck because of one card or one tactic, and then what you find is that one thing loses its luster over time, but the rest of the shell ends up impressing you a lot. And that's exactly what happened to me with this deck this weekend.
Yeah, I had a very similar experience. Omnath, oh my god.
Messed up.
I will add on the Chalice of the Void point. The Grixis deck really hammers that home. They can just play a full game against you with a Chalice on the battlefield. It doesn't matter to them. They've just got a million Kolaghan's commands, Snapcasters, Expressive Iterations, Drown on the Lock. Who cares? They'll just kill the Chalice eventually. But they won't beat Omnath. They will never defeat. No one ever beats Omnath in this format. I had Omnath in playing these decks. My opponent had resolved Teferi, other Teferi, and Ren in 6, and I cast Omnath when the game ended.
Is this because you followed it up by making 2 additional land drops, casting another spell, dealing 4 to all of their planeswalkers at once, because for some reason that's a line of text on the card? It just does everything. It bails you out of so many spots, even in matchups where you would think, okay, the life gain maybe doesn't matter, or I don't have an obvious thing to use this burst of mana on, so how much is this card really doing for me? It just somehow finds a way for one of its 20 different lines of text to come through somehow. And yeah, that card just constantly overperforms for me. And I was in here asking last week, it seemed like we agreed on the merits of the shell, but my one question was, is Dryad actually worth the deck building cost here, where you have to play 4 copies of Valakut in a mana base, which is already a little tough to juggle everything in? And my answer after this weekend is yes, definitively. There were so many games where we were kind of at parity, and I would just draw a Dryad with a Valakut on the battlefield and fetch land in my hand, and they were locked out of the game. The game was over. Or you had these. There are actually, I would say, 2 different Splinter Twin-esque situations with Dryad, where Ren 6 and Dryad often that is the perfect curve where the game is going to end on turn 4, or you just have turn 3 Dryad into turn 4 Bring to Light backed up by a removal spell at some point earlier in there, and that's enough to race basically everyone too. So yeah, Dryad, on top of fixing your mana, where it is weird, you're making your mana worse up front in order to support Dryad, but then once Dryad is in play, mana just doesn't exist as a constraint anymore, so you just get to do whatever you want. Tapping your fetch lands for mana so you don't even have to use them immediately, or it just answers all of your questions. So yeah, that card was fantastic. And once you put the chalices in the sideboard, that leaves you with more room to do whatever you want with, which for me was adding more copies of Fire Ice, which consistently overperformed on the weekend, but maybe you get to play stuff like Lightning Bolt or Path to Exile now that you don't have to worry about chalicing out your own 1-drops, or you can find ways to fill that gap.
Yeah, I'll make 2 more points on Dryad. One is that it lets you fetch for a single basic and still evade Blood Moon. That was a big issue with a lot of the non-Dryad Ren and Tef decks that I played, and I know Andrea Mengucci has been tweeting about losing to Blood Moon all the time with the 4-color control pile. You would have to fetch a basic Plains and another basic so you can Prismatic Ending. But now if you just have a forest, you can cast Dryad after the Blood Moon and just be fine. And then the other thing about Dryad is that it used to be that it would just eat a Fatal Push or something. The card it eats is Unholy Heat. That's just going to go for your Planeswalker anyways. You're just cutting 4 of 12 targets if you cut the Dryad. It's not changing.
Right, and you sometimes get into these mid-game positions where you play Dryad, you play a fetch land, and trigger your Valakut targeting something, and even if they have the removal spell, you get to crack the fetch land in response, shoot the same thing again, and so you get the 4 value out of there, you've drawn out their removal spell, and if they don't have the removal spell, the game is over. So you really put them to the test, you put them in check, and they need to have one of, a small number of specific cards, which, if it's not a small number, if they have a whole bunch of Unholy Heats and Fatal Pushes and so on, then the rest of their draw probably isn't doing all that much. And so you have the time to just cast a Bring to Light or build towards whatever other endgame you have going on.
Yeah, just this deck is pretty great, I think. There's a lot of room to flex with it, too. That's one of my other favorite parts about it.
Flex as in flex slots to incorporate in, or just to flex on your opponents here?
Yes to both. My opponents got exceptionally demoralized when I untapped with Dryads and Valakutes.
Yeah, it's weird that this deck almost feels like a dinosaur in a format where, okay, yeah, you get Prismatic Ending from MH2, and I think that legitimately is a big addition to the deck, but you don't have a dozen different MH2 cards rounding out your deck, and it feels like when the rest of the format is playing super low curves, often backed up by cards like Lurrus or Murktide Regent, you are the one deck actually trying to go up to the curve to these 4-drops and 5-drops, and it feels like you're playing a different game and a slower game sometimes to the rest of the format. At the same time, if you take a step back from the current context and look at this deck, it is chock full of these busted 2019, 2020 cards where whether it's that gruesome twosome of Red and 6 and Teferi, or Omnath, which really cannot overstate how messed up that card is, or Dryad itself, which was really just a game changer for so many of these decks in Modern. This deck is just wall-to-wall bangers. Even the Triomes, which I don't know if this mana base would be remotely functional without the Triomes, just gluing everything together. If you showed this deck to someone who, let's say in pre-War of the Spark Modern, in like January 2019, I think they would be amazed at just what had changed even with this deck.
Yeah, but it also looks like a deck that existed 10 years ago. I mean, like, how different is this from like Prismatic Omen Wargate Scapeshift that like won an extended Grand Prix? I'm using the word extended. That should tell you about when it happened.
Yeah, boomer alert. Yeah, I mean, that was, I would say, the sweetest deck in its format back in the day. And this is in contention for sweetest deck in this format too. Let's stay on the 4-color theme and also stay on the Magic 2020 was a mess up set theme and talk about Risen Reef once again, because Canister won the Sunday Challenge with his latest take on the Elementals deck. And compared to some of the previous iterations, I think this is a big leap forward in some regards, where this is a Ren and 6 and Teferi deck. You could mistake this if you didn't know what Risen Reef did for some of these other kind of 4-color soup decks. But it's weaving that in seamlessly enough, I would say. You have some issues with the mana where like Cavern of Souls with Ren and 6 leads to some awkward draws sometimes, but for the most part, you're blending the best parts of this 4-color interactive shell with the Planeswalkers, and then this Risen Reef Evoke creatures package, which, you know, it's weird to capture the cadence of the games with this deck, where you're kind of doing a bunch of nothing until you cast Risen Reef, and then you're doing everything on a single turn cycle. And then sometimes you're doing nothing, but that's because, you know, your Solitude doesn't have a target yet. And as soon as that presents itself, you're casting Solitude, you're ephemerrating it into play, and suddenly the whole game is being flipped in your favor, and they now need to do something just to stay back in it.
Yeah, I would also like to point out how awesome the Teferi plus Risen Reef interaction is, because all you want with Risen Reef is to get in and get your value. And like when it gets bolted, it's not like a bad exchange because, you know, you get a card out of it, but like you would rather it not get bolted in response to you doing more things. And if you have a Teferi in play, that's just going to happen.
Yeah, or even just stuff like you've hardcast a Fury or a Solitude at some point, and now you get to bounce it back up and recast it for free to get that effect once again. Or if you have Risen Reef, then Flamekin Harbinger with Teferi, you can like bounce the Harbinger to keep training itself, to find the next pitch elemental to insulate yourself against whatever they have going on. So I like that this deck, which it's a weird mixture of like clunky spells and free spells at the same time. Once you have 4 Utopia Sprawl, 3 Flamekin Harbinger to set up those later turns, while also blocking Ragavan or DRC in the early game, which I think is more relevant than it might appear. And then, you know, this deck has 2 Prismatic Ending and a 1 Lightning Bolt just to keep them on their toes in the early game here. You actually have enough stuff to just play a fair game early, or go like Utopia Sprawl into Teferi or Risen Reef on turn 2, which is pretty nice. So that clunkiness, which seemed somewhat intrinsic to the deck before, you know, you're not having your first play of the game be turn 2 Voice of Resurgence, which was not a great idea 5 years ago, certainly not a great idea in 2021. We're kind of cutting out the middleman now and just going straight to the broken cards.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that even these broken Planeswalkers or whatever, they just have the same good colors that Voice of Resurgence or Unsettled Mariner would have. Like, you can just cut bad cards and play good cards that have the same exact property,
And guess what? You never really wanted to even cast those good cards anyways, so who cared? Or the bad cards anyways.
Right.
Or the good cards maybe, who knows?
I know Canister was saying that ideally Ren and 6 would be a Boros card just to have, Fury and Solitude upside, but you take what you can get here.
Yeah, it's you got your spreads, there are a bunch of force negations in this sideboard, so you got both sides of both pitches, right? Endurance, force negation, force of vigor, fury. You're going to get usage out of those colors somehow.
Yeah, this deck looks just very real to me and very good, and I like that because this deck on the surface looks very sweet, but I wonder if beneath that surface, this is just another reskinned version of that kind of a Cascade spells template, where I have the one gimmick of my deck, which I do as often as I can, and then I have, a dozen different free spells where, you can never really trade up on mana against me, and if you try to trade up on cards, well, eventually I'm just going to hardcast these cards and beat you with them anyway.
Yeah, but the difference between Fury and Monstrous Carabid is a big one.
Explain, Ari.
Well, you see, one of them is a 4/4 beetle, and it must attack every turn if able. So that one does pitch to grief, so it has seen a little bit of play, right?
Yeah, that is the most relevant part of that card is the kind of half black tint in the text box.
Yeah, if you still for some reason have not played with or against Fury, just be very aware that one of the best things it will do is attack you.
Yeah, it's you can discount the body on Solitude, let's say, 3/2 lifelink. How relevant is that? Endurance, I think that comes up more, but that one you mostly intend to hardcast unless you're against exactly Living End, right? And the whole idea of ambushing a channeler that had to attack with your conveniently sized 3/4, that is the point. That's part of why you're playing that card. But yeah, with Fury, it's easy to think of this as just Pyrokinesis, which already fantastic card, which would make some waves in Modern. But yeah, you just get to 5 mana and you cast a 3/3 double strike, and they can't block it anymore because Fury just killed all of their blockers, and then they die in short order. And I mean, even the Kahira pump with double strike comes up sometimes. So yeah, that's another thing too. Is this is a 4 Omnath Locus of Creation deck where you just get to use every single part of the Buffalo, even the hidden ones, even the stretch goals there, and in the past, we've seen these Omnath decks try to work in ways to use 5 mana, where you play Omnath, you play in Cracker Fetchland, you have 5 mana now, and Solitude and Fury give you amazing ways to do that don't even cost 5 most of the time.
Yeah, it's the ability to spend mana in these decks in any Solitude deck really is pretty clutch. I'll also note that, all the way back to the top, we were talking about Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. And one of the things that held that card back for so long is the presence of Solitude. So this deck has a little bit of a leg up against anyone trying to do single big creature nonsense, because Emrakul certainly does not have protection from that free spell. It doesn't make sense. Right.
So other than Rafu Tapper and his Timeless Dragons, or Timeless Dragon, we should say, anything else stand out to you from this batch of results here?
There were a couple of this Jund Collected Company deck in the same challenge. I don't have thoughts significantly about it, but there sure are some cards in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a collected company and a bunch of creatures that cost 3 or less, and that's all you really need to know about it.
Yeah, certainly some interesting creatures, so that's all I got on it.
Yeah, I will leave it as an exercise to the reader to discover that one for themselves. Beyond that, I guess Musasabi, we're obliged to mention every few weeks here, so we're going to take that one off the list for July. Showing up here with a Jund Lurrus deck. So this is mostly the same stuff you'll be familiar with from the Rakdos Lurrus decks, but Tarmogoyf, just a great card in a world of Sanctifier on deck where you actually need a threat that doesn't get completely hosed by that card, and Tarmogoyf is the card you want. And then Red and 6, which is an ideal engine piece to return with Lurrus, and we've mentioned that Red and 6 is not just the first card you want to see in your opening hand against any kind of slower deck. It's also against these Ragavan decks. You kill their Ragavan, you kill their DRC, and force them to spend an Unholy Heat or something. You're more than happy with that exchange. And Ross Merriam went so far as to say in his article this week, titled, Ren and 6 is the best card in Modern, or the most underrated card in Modern right now. I think he's on the money there, and getting to have all the benefits of the Rakdos shell with Ren and 6, I think, is a good place to be. This makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I do. I don't know how great Tarmogoyf is or isn't. I don't love how it lines up against like Prismatic Ending as opposed to the other cards. Like when I mean, I get that Prismatic Ending always trades even on mana, but it feels like it trades a little less even the more expensive the thing that it trades for is, because it's more likely like the way these Prismatic Ending decks are set up, like with Omnath, like they're going to care less about their mana than the decks that have like a Tarmogoyf are. So when you trade 2 mana for their 2 mana, that feels like it's trading down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it is big. It also like there's the whole like 2-drop on the draw versus Ragavan thing to think about. That's like a really big strain point. But I mean, Tarmogoyf still is big.
Yeah, I mean, I think with this deck, you have your discard spells, you have your own Unholy Heats, pushes, bolts, and so on, and your own Ragavans and DRCs if you want them. So I think that issue of how do I deal with a 2-1 on turn 1, I think you mostly have that covered. But this is a deck which can now put opponents to that same test as well. So I guess the takeaway here is if you have that foiled out John deck that you've been playing at FNM every week for the past 8 years, don't give up hope. There is I guess the foil Ragavans may make you lose all hope, but there is some kind of light at the end of that tunnel.
Yeah, you are allowed to play with non-foil Ragavans. I don't know what the Ragavan to Marmoset exchange rate is, but I'm sure if you have a spare Marmoset, you can probably get a non-foil set.
Yeah, I think the John player, like the code of conduct means you have to play with foils if you're playing that deck. But as far as I can tell, I have not been formally invited into that club myself.
Yeah, I have not played with foils in a long time, so I believe I am legally obliged to never play John again. Correct? That's how it works?
Correct. Okay. Yeah, so that's a lot of talking about decks that aren't Is It Murktide Regent, which is still very much in contention for best deck in Modern. And we'll take a short break, and then we'll get the boy genius, Milan Bayana, in here to take you through all of that.
The SCG Tour Online is back. Starting Friday, July 23rd, you can play the best events in competitive Magic for thousands of dollars in cash prizes, piles of MTG Arena gems, MTG Arena qualifier invitations to skip that mythic grind, and at the very top, invitations to the MTG Arena Championships and the StarCityGames.com Invitational returning to Roanoke, Virginia from October 29th to October 31st. You heard that right. The SCG Invitational is also back. And you know the best place to qualify for it? That's right, the SCG Tour Online. Check out StarCityGames.com/SCG Tour Online to register for events, see upcoming event schedules, and get all the details on how you can earn prizes and invitations playing the SCG Tour Online.
All right, here for the main event, a deep dive into the Is It Murktide Regent decks in Modern. And here with us for that is one of the leading innovators behind that archetype, King of the Zoomers, probably a future ruler of us all, and TikTok sensation, Milan Bayana. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me. Very exciting to be here.
Would you say any or all of that introduction is...
I'd say it's perfectly accurate.
Wonderful. So we wanted to get you in here, and by this point, enough people have succeeded with your take on this deck that we really could have had a number of different people in here to go for a deep dive on this, but we thought we'd go straight to the source here. And I think we can trace this mostly to a few weeks ago at the start of the month, the Modern Showcase event, which you are now qualified for thanks to taking that tournament by storm with this deck. What was it that really clued you into the potential of this archetype in Modern, and how did you go about approaching building that deck yourself?
So I saw some preliminary lists from the challenge the week before and decided to run it in the first prelim that week on Monday. I went 3-1. I lost the 4-0 match to throwing the game completely, and I was pretty hooked on the deck from there. And I got 2 more 4-0s in that same week in prelims while iterating more on the deck that week. And I think I reached a really good build for that weekend and just felt like I was honestly playing a completely different format than all my other opponents that event.
Mm-hmm. In my experience with you, I associate you as someone who wants to hone in on the best deck and then tries to refine the best deck, get your reps in with it, and just be the enemy in the format. Basically, be the person who everyone thinks they're trying to beat, but no one actually has as good of a matchup as they believe they do. And there are various other decks, both in Modern and in other formats. So is it Phoenix in the past? Is it Paris? And then looking to Legacy, you have the Delver decks, which I know more recently you've iterated on a lot and had some success with there. Do you think those are useful comparisons for this deck, or is that more misleading than illuminating for you?
I think that the comparison to Is It Delver and Legacy is a really good comparison. They both have very similar play styles, and while you don't have the power of the free counterspells like Daze and Force of Will, you do still have very similar play styles, which I think makes it really good if you have experience in one deck to translate over to the other.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess I think I have the timeline right here where, before you really dipped your toe, it makes sense to ask the opposite question is, how did your experience deck inform how you approached learning and then improving Delver for the first time?
Well, when I first started building Delver for the Showcase Challenge 2 weeks ago, which I top aided, I started off by kind of challenging what the basic list was, because I felt like you weren't actually using your most powerful cards. My biggest issue is that the card Delver of Secrets is a bad Magic card. And I really wanted to replace that with an artifact so I could more consistently enable Delirium for Dragon Rage Channeler, which I thought was possibly even better than Ragavan in a lot of these shells.
Yeah, you see these lists with 3 Delver of Secrets and some Mishra's Baubles, and you start thinking, either this person really knows what they're doing, or they have gone completely off the deep end, and sometimes maybe it's a little bit of both. But it is wild that you certainly see this in Legacy, where the Delver deck has for so long been this absolute boogeyman of the format, and now the namesake card is maybe the third best one that deck has access to, and you're kind of seeing the same compression now in Modern as well, where you have Dragon's Rage Channeler, you have Ragavan, both of those all-stars in the Legacy deck too. And then the card Delver of Secrets, I think Modern players are well placed to explain just why that is a conditional card, if not an outright bad one. So you have to find some alternative threats to make up the numbers here. I know initially in that Showcase list, you had Dreadhorde Arcanist, and then the list that Nathan Stewart won the Super Qualifier with this past weekend had a Snapcaster Mage, I think. And then, of course, maybe this deck's namesake in Murktide Regent is the premier threat that the deck has access to. Roughly how many threats are you looking for with this deck? And, are you always keeping all of these in every matchups? Are there times where you sideboard out Ragavan? Is that like a play versus draw consideration? What goes into that threat mix for you?
I think that the 4 DRCs, Dragon Rage Channelers, 4 Ragavans, and 4 Murktides are, I think, honestly the best cards in the deck, and they are cards that you should extraordinarily rarely cut. I think I can count on one hand the number of times I've cut them in the deck, and I've played probably 40 or 50 matches with the deck.
Mm-hmm. And so those tertiary threats like the Arcanist, like the Snapcaster Mage, are those just strictly not needed, or are those a kind of flex slots where, if you expect a lot of decks to have heavy removal, let's say, you want more threats just to grind through that, or what goes into deciding some of those final flex slots there?
I think that the deck really has like 53 really busted Magic cards, and then you've kind of got to fill out the rest with some mix of like Archmage's Charms, counter spells, Dreadhorde Arcanist, Sleight of Hand, whatever really is tuned for the specific metagame of the weekend, which I think is the reason I love this deck so much, because you have so much card selection that those one of choices matter so much.
That's something that really stood out about that Showcase list for me, was that you moved away from these blue heavy reactive cards like Counterspell, like Archmage's Charm. I believe that list had 2 Counterspell was the final count there, where a lot of people were showing up to those tournaments with 4 Counterspell, 4 Archmage's Charm, maybe some Force Negations working their way in there too. And you took a much more proactive stance with the deck. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think in a format like Modern right now, where it's just dominated by the most efficient and most powerful 1-drops out there, right? Like Colossus Hammer is honestly a pretty good Magic card when you're immediately equipping it and hitting for 10 extra damage. Of course, Dragon Rage Channeler, Ragavan, all of these cards motivate you to play a really low curve, and that's where cards like Counterspells are the worst, because you're almost always trading even or even down on mana. And you have this, of course, this huge downside of being forced to hold up this mana rather than developing your own game plan.
So, yeah. So I know I've been playing decks on the clunkier side, so I haven't quite had this interchange. Against like the faster decks, I know that, there's this kind of removal fork that's going on where Murktide Regent and Ragavan demand like a completely separate set of answers. But how much of this deck's success is due to expressive iteration on that front, being able to just kind of power through removal? How much of its success against answers is like just the raw number of cantrips? And how much of it is that threat split? Because, if you look at these threats, they are all, 1-for-1s on their surface, but this deck is consistently able to just kind of beat decks that are trying to beat it with 1-for-1s.
Yeah, I think the two reasons that make this deck so dominant right now in Modern are actually Murktide Regent and Expressive Iteration, which is a little bit odd considering how powerful the 1-drops and what I've talked about so much in so far about the powerful 1-drop is Expressive Iteration really puts a different angle on the entire attack plan. It's a really efficient card advantage spell, which just pairs so well with all these 1-mana threats you have. And of course, Murktide Regent is just a card that pressures your opponent in a way that people don't have answers for in Modern right now. You're seeing people starting to play Terminates in their deck in red-black to try to have an answer to Murktide Regent. And I mean, Terminate, if Delver Secrets is a bad Magic card, Terminate's a terrible one. It trades down on mana so often, and it's really, really inefficient in this format. And it just shows how much pressure Murktide Regent puts on these opponents to have an answer to it, and which allows us to pull ahead with cards like Expressive Iteration and the 1-drop creatures.
Yeah, it is wild to think that certainly back in the day when it was first released, but for quite a few years after that, Terminate was the gold standard of this removal spell is not just flexible, but it's cheap, it's efficient as well. And now 2 mana feels like it's just so expensive and so clunky in a format where the best threats or, they cost 1 mana, or Murktide Regent, I guess, costs 2, so technically you're mana neutral there, but like you need to have that exact removal spell, or is Charlotte's Agent cascading into Living End or Crashing Footfalls, and it just feels like trading 1-for-1 and spending 2 mana on a removal spell really feels like an antiquated idea, certainly in Modern as it stands right now.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think like a kind of a motto of mine playing any Magic formats is you always want to be the person presenting the threats, not the answers. If I put a 2-mana 8/8 into play and you have a Terminate, we traded 1-for-1. If I put a 2-mana 8/8 into play and you don't have an answer, you die.
Yeah, and that's really reflected at the moment, right? Like the Hammer deck, okay, it's not just an 8/8, it's a 11/11 with poison or whatever. It's you present these cheap threats, and if they aren't contested, you win the game, and if they are, you have Lurrus, you have Urza Saga, Expressive Iteration, whatever it is to refuel and present that second wave. And it feels like playing that purely reactive game is just kind of a lost cause right now.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think also the Hammer Time matchup was one of the decks I almost shifted off this deck after the showcase 2 weeks ago because it felt like this Hammer Time matchup was too close. No matter what flex thoughts I was including, I really couldn't get it above like 50, 52, 53%. I think a big part of the breakthrough was the main deck engineered explosives, which I know Nathan had great use of during this event. And it's a card that I'm a really big fan of running. I think having that one copy of main deck answer when you play so many cantrips, which hits your opponent from an angle that is really hard for them to beat, is just so valuable in this format.
Yeah, let's talk about that matchup on the whole then, because I think that is the deck you have to be able to beat right now. And I think initially, if you haven't played that matchup or seen it in action, you look at the two decks and you think, all right, this Izzet deck has a bunch of good removal spells, some cheap threats, so lots of different types of interaction. This should be a great matchup for the Izzet deck. And then in practice, it doesn't really seem to play out that way. It seems a lot closer than you'd think it would be. And then the Hammer Time proponents, the people doing well with the deck, to win a tournament right now, you have to get through some good Izzet opponents. And so it's easy to come away from that thinking, all right, well, Hammer crushes this matchup because I did well this weekend to do that. Where do you think that true matchup actually lies? Is it, the Hammer players think they win it, the Izzet players think they win it? Where does the truth actually lie within there?
I really think it's as pretty close to even as you can get in Modern right now. I think both decks are, while Hammer looks like it's an easy deck to play, you've got these bunch of 1 minute things, you hit your opponent for 20. I think it's actually surprisingly difficult to play. So I do think that the matchup comes down a lot to player skill. I mean, for both sides, there are so many little decisions you have to make in your sequencing, in your card selection, in your sideboarding, that I really think it's a very much player edge to determine these matches.
Yeah, if all your cards cost 1, you have a ton of decisions to make. It kind of gives you the most options possible as opposed to anything else. We did mention Terminate not being great, but can you talk to me about Unholy Heat and how that card has kind of been one of, in addition to the 1-drops, one of the things that's kind of transformed red decks out of Modern Horizons 2?
Yeah, I think Unholy Heat is one of the best things. Well, really, there's so many cards. This archetype could not have existed before Modern Horizons 2. It gave it all of the best threats, the best answers on Unholy Heat. I think the biggest thing that Unholy Heat has brought is almost a complete flip of the Amulet Titan matchup. Having a 1-mana answer to Primeval Titan is just so huge in that matchup, which this sort of deck would typically struggle with, having to have a counterspell, which could be beat by Cavern of Souls, having to have some sort of way to interact with it, maybe like 2 bolts. Having this one simple 1 red mana answer that you can keep up fairly easily, I think has done wonders for that matchup.
Yeah, it seems like the type of deck that those more counter-heavy decks would be better against, so the big mana decks or the combo decks, those don't really exist in a traditional form, and you go back to week 1 when it seemed like Amulet Titan was going to be everywhere. That deck has essentially vanished from the metagame at this point, and so it seems like, setting your deck up to fight these DRC and Ragavan mirrors and to fight through the cheap creature decks, that seems like a much better approach to be taking at the moment.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think I know a lot of people were proposing playing with Tarmogoyf and stuff like that, and it is pretty crazy how cleanly Unholy Heat just deals with almost so much nonsense that can happen in Modern. Like, I've played against multiple Jund opponents recently, and I mean, Tarmogoyf should be a complete beating for this style of deck. You've got some bolts and not really any other ways to deal with it. But again, Unholy Heat, I think, just insulates you against so much of the randomness of Modern, which has always been a key trait of the format.
Coming back to that Hammer matchup quickly, you mentioned that it's not just close, but it's also quite intricate. What are the things which, as you play the matchup more and more, you started to appreciate as being important? Are there things which might not seem important at first, but actually are, or anything that's maybe counterintuitive for someone who doesn't have those reps just yet?
I think on first glance, when playing against Hammer, the first instinct is always going to be to treat it like a burn matchup or a highly aggro matchup where you just try to kill everything on site and you don't really care about getting your full value out of each of your cards. And I think that's a big mistake you can make. With the new builds of Hammer, having Luris, having Pure Steel Paladin, all of these cards, it's a very effective deck at actually grinding out card advantage. Esper Sentinel is a huge thing that allows it to play well beyond a typical aggro deck. And I think that's a big mistake a lot of people make when first playing in that matchup, is to treat it like a typical aggro deck.
And how does your strategy factor into that? Is there anything which, if you expect a hammer-heavy field, as I think you do at the moment, are there cards which you make sure you don't leave home without?
I think Engineered Explosive is the biggest card. I think it's one of the best Sideboard cards in Modern right now. It's obviously fantastic against Hammer Time, putting it on 1. Obviously stops Colossus Hammer, deals with Esper Sentinel. You can put it on 0 as well as deal with the 0 drops, like Memnite and Ornithopter, which provide a lot of the most aggressive starts. I think the other cards that I think are very important in the matchup, I think Kozilek's Return weirdly is one of your more important cards. Post sideboard, this is again, you kind of have to look at what your opponent has post sideboard and what their game 2 configuration is rather than just their game 1. Hammer Time has many copies of Sanctifier and Vec, which has protection from black and red, which would normally be really good against this deck. It helps to shut off your graveyard and is something you can't kill. And so you're just going to get hit by that hammer over and over again, which is what Kozilek Return purpose is there for, to deal with their biggest sideboard juke.
It's always been this weird card in Modern where usually the devoid text on the card is just trinket text. It's there just to clutter up the text box. But if you see Kozilek's Return, it's usually because traditional red removal like isn't going to be as effective red creature or something that you have to worry about. And so that actually becomes maybe the most important part of the entire card.
Yeah, definitely.
So
looking at that the hammer matchup, aside, I know that Sanctifier is a significantly bigger issue for the Rakdos decks than this deck, but aside from Sanctifier, are they, what else are they doing that's specifically targeted at this deck, that might, be able to take out like a Murktide, or is like a Resolve Murktide just kind of gonna fly against them and not really go oppose?
So a lot of Hammer Time players can bring in Path to Exile or On Thin Ice, or similar cards like that. I think that that's an interesting option to deal with Murktide, but I also don't think you can afford to dilute your Hammer deck that much, which is an issue I know that I've played against when I played Hammer. So I think generally a Murktide is pretty hard to beat, resolved from the blue-red side, but Hammer can certainly bring in answers, although I'm not sure it's correct to do so.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get into some more general sideboarding strategy with this deck after a short break. Don't go anywhere. Alright folks, we're taking a brief time out here to talk about SCG Premium, and for the low price of just $7.99 a month, which is less than the cost of one collector booster, by the way, here's what you get. 5% off sealed product, 10% off singles, 15% off supplies, and that's everything from sleeves, deck boxes, to binders, and so much more. If you're making a big order to get ready for Paper Magic again, that month of premium just paid for itself. On top of that, you get more content and better content than anywhere else at the best prices. If you're here now with me and Ari and you like what you hear, you can get our weekly columns, but that's only the start. How about the literal world champion, and for my money, the best player of all time, Paulo Vitor Damagerosa? How about Pro Tour champions and Mythic champions from Joey Thompson to Autumn Burchett? We have the best standard player of all time, perhaps, in Brad Nelson, and the best limited mind in the game right now in Sam Black, and so much more. And if one piece of advice from any of us helps you win just one more round in a tournament, well, that month of premium just paid for itself many times over. Get the best discounts and the best content over at starcitygames.com/join-premium. All right, and we're back here to round out our discussion of the Is It Murktide deck in Modern here with Milan Bayana. And you mentioned that a lot of the main deck slots in this deck are effectively locked in, and those remaining few slots are, I think, what gave you and Nathan your success in your respective tournaments. But I think the sideboard is where you tend to have a bit more flexibility there. And so, you have decisions now like, do you really go hard on stuff like Chalice of the Void for the Cascade decks? How much do you prepare for the Hammer matchup, and exactly how do you do that? What was your approach that you took in constructing this sideboard here?
So for the sideboard that I constructed for this past weekend's PTQ, which is the sideboard Nathan used to win the event, I wanted to focus mainly on Hammer and the Mirror, as I thought those would be the two most popular archetypes. In the main deck, the biggest considerations I made was putting Archmage's Charm, which is a card I normally do not like at all. But I think it's very important in both the Hammer and the Mirror matchups. And despite its clunkiness, I think it's too important of a card to leave out. In the sideboard, I think having Kozilek's Return, multiple copies of Abrade, as well as multiple copies of Engineered Explosive are really important against Hammer. And I think in the Mirror, Soul Guide Lantern is a card that I really like, as Murktides are a big point of contention and a big way that you lose in that matchup.
Yeah, I noticed one copy of Mystical Dispute in the sideboard. That's a card that I've liked in other decks facing off against the Regent decks. Is that a go-to card in the Mirror, or is it does it not really line up well the way you need it to there?
I think Mystical Dispute is good in the Mirror. However, there's always this tension of having too many counterspells post-board. With both players having so many cantrips, if you're just sitting back and hoping to counter whatever they're doing, and they're just churning through their deck, they're going to build a perfect hand while you're stuck just holding up this mana every turn. But I do think that Mystical Dispute is the best counterspell for the Mirror, as it's the cheapest and is really powerful at stopping the later games, the cards that are good in the later stages of the game, like Expressive Iteration and Archmage's Charm, as well as Murktide Regent. But I wouldn't play more than one. I don't think you want to be boarding up that many counters post board.
So moving away from the Mirror, I noticed like the two kind of heavy hitters that you have in the sideboard that would not really necessarily apply there are Blood Moon and Flusterstorm. I guess talk a bit about Flusterstorm, because that's a card that kind of flew under the radar after it slid kind of into the outskirts of Modern Horizons 1.
And then I guess dive into Blood Moon, because that is kind of a big game changer for this deck against the rest of the field.
Yeah. So I think Flusterstorm's a little bit of a weird one. It's been a lot pushed out in Modern because the matchups you typically want it for are the blue matchups, where Mystical Dispute has really just done its job better. But since I just identified early on in testing that I didn't want that many counter spells in the mirror, I didn't want to be boarding in 3 or 4 counter spells on the sideboard. I picked Flusterstorm as my counter of choice against decks like Rhino, Living End, and that style of deck, because it does serve a better role against those decks if you're not actually looking to use it to counter these blue spells.
And so you had this list which you optimized for this weekend, and Nathan was able to take the event down with it. I'm sure this deck will remain a player going forward in some configuration, and you'll be changing slots here and there to deal with whatever new decks pop up over time. What, in a big picture sense, what's important to keep in mind with this deck?
I think a big mistake that people, when playing this deck, is treating it as like more of a control deck. I mean, sure, you have these counter spells, but you're primarily, honestly, more of an aggressive deck. You're a tempo deck. You're putting pressure on your opponents through their life total and kind of using that to gain card advantage, in a sense. If your opponent is squeezed into a position where they're having to defend their life total aggressively, they're not able to use their cards as well. And I think that a big issue is people keep up counters in this deck instead of jamming threats very often. And I think that jamming and making them have it is something that's really important to do with this deck, because generally you have some 2-for-1s, but the majority of your deck is always trading 1-for-1. So you need to be putting other sources of pressure on your opponent to win games.
I think maybe people's expectations were knocked off kilter a bit by the Is It Prowess decks from a few months ago and their dominance in the format, where you had this hyper-aggressive deck that could also refuel with cards like Iteration, and they had big threats like Storming Entity kind of in that Murktide Regent role, and that maybe led people to assume this deck was like more hyper-aggressive than it is. But then we mentioned these Delver comparisons and Legacy, which is more of like the Is It Tempo deck, I guess is how it would get labeled on the Star City Games website. And it feels like this deck resists that kind of easy classification. And if you try to pigeonhole it into any one of those things, then you're not going to be unlocking its full potential there.
Definitely. It's a deck you really have to identify what your position in every matchup is in. I think a big source of losses can coming from having this much card selection. If you don't correctly identify what your role is in the matchup and what you need to do in that matchup to win, you can end up picking the wrong cards in situations, which almost always leads to your defeat.
And so I think that covers most of the discussion points that we had here. Is there anything else that you'd like to put out there into the universe about this deck, or just, I guess, about Modern in general while we're here?
Oh, if I have one thing to tell people, it's if you're copying Nathan's list from last weekend, get rid of the Aether Gust and the Subtlety and replace them with Force Negations. They're a lot better. Nathan just can afford them.
I look into the Magic Online economy as it currently stands here in July 2021.
And one closing question. If people are concerned about trying to beat, is it Murktide, is it Regent, is it mid-range tempo, whatever you want to call it, what would you suggest they do? If the answer is just play the mirror, I'm all in for that.
I think this is a deck that's very hard to attack properly. It's a deck with a lot of card advantage, a lot of flex slots you can change, and it's not like a deck that relies on any specific card. So I think that the best way to do it is to pick decks that are good against it. Don't just change a couple random slots in your sideboard and think you're good.
And so with that in mind, if anyone has any further questions or just wants to follow your future success, which I'm sure is guaranteed to come, where can they be finding you?
You can find me on Twitter at MTG Milan. And if you want to watch cooking videos, you can find me on TikTok at Lil Chef Mill.
Yeah, your amount of TikTok clout is truly unparalleled, I think, in the Magic community. So some crossover there might be useful.
Of course.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, and we'll talk to you soon. And when you win another tournament, I'm sure I'll have you in here again, if that's okay with you.
I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, thank you very much.
What's up, everyone? Justin Parnell here.
Along with Ryan Overturf, and we want to tell you about the single best podcast on the SCG network.
Well, obviously, Ryan, you're talking about the 540.
Indeed I am, and that is the best podcast because we talk about the best format in the history of Magic.
Cube Draft?
Cube Draft.
Every week we go over all things Cube.
We're talking about in-depth reviews of brand new cards.
The best ways to draft and think about Arena and Magic Online Cube formats,
as well as ways to play with your friends,
and ways to play with your enemies.
Also some ways to make your friends into your enemies.
And cardboard takes of a variety of temperatures.
So if you're a fan of structured nonsense,
or if you hate it,
either way, all the same, check out the 540 every week wherever you find your podcasts and right here on StarCityGames.com.
And we are back here to close out the episode with, of course, a nonsense of the week. And I was getting a little worried here because, again, people were really keeping it on the straight and narrow. I didn't know if with some of these higher stakes events this weekend, people were kind of keeping their eye on the prize and not getting too adventurous. But the league done today, which you very kindly trawled through in advance of this segment, I think may have saved the day for us.
Yeah. There's some good stuff in this one. I think that if you want to point to anything diluting the nonsense factor, it's the thing I said about the good cards just being so flexible. It's very easy to feel like you're playing a deck that's different than everyone else, but it's really just like from the same pool of 50 cards that is just good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One of the things, though, I like this little bad card sighting in a otherwise good deck. From the league dump today, this is Antoine 57437 with a Bant deck.
Oh, God. I recognize that name and those numbers, so I know what's in store here.
Oh, you do?
Well,
okay.
I know this is a Wastelands Triangle enthusiast, if I recall correctly.
Okay, well, they have changed to the other side of things. They were, so the league dump on the 20th, they were playing Bant as well, but more of the, like, I don't want to say classic, but like classic, like one soul herder thing that's been popping up. And now they're trying something new and fresh that they 5-0'd with. This is, it's like 4 Ice Fangs, 4 Eternal Witness, 4 Solitude, some random creatures because you can, Eldamari's call for them. But also like 4 Counterspell, and then 2 Familiar's Ruse. So this is like an Ether Vial, Familiar's Ruse, pick up your Eternal Witness and loop and lock them deck. But also you can set up where, like, if they have a creature and then play a spell, you can Solitude their creature, and then with the other Evoke trigger on the stack, pick it up with Familiar's Ruse and counter their spell.
Okay, I think I follow that.
Yeah, the rest of this deck is all pretty standard stuff, but I just like really, really like that nice addition of being able to, like, your opponent's like, I have a creature, I'm going to cast a spell, and then you're like, no, none of this is good for you.
Well, you're not casting that spell, and wait until you hear what I have in store for all of the rest of your spells for the rest of this game.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
So we've seen Familiar's Ruse, with Spellstutter Sprite in other formats, a popular combination there. But yeah, I can see why with all of these different Evoke features, that's a really nice twist on it.
Yeah, for those who don't know what this card is, it's Counterspell, but as an additional cost, you have to return a creature you control to its owner's hand. So like you get that like little tiny window with the Evoke creature on the battlefield to pick it back up.
Yeah, and previously, if you wanted to have a hard counterspell for blue, it was tough pickings. You know, Deprive worked its way into some decks back in the day, or you really had to scrape the bottom of the barrel. Now you have actual factual counterspell to go to. So having Familiar's Ruse in your deck in 2021, that is a bold statement that I have no choice but to respect.
I respect that it's Familiar's Ruse in addition to the counterspells. It's like, I've considered counterspell, I'm going to play it, and then in addition, I'm also going to do whatever nonsense I can think of.
Oh yeah, I didn't forget that counterspell existed or anything. I know. You don't have to remind me. I want to do the thing, and I will do the thing against you, and you will suffer from the thing.
Okay, what did you have picked out from the previous league dump? You had picked out a little classic, right?
Yeah, so this is I guess you would call it is it Eldrazi deck, although really stretching the color terms loosely there. So this is basically the old colorless Eldrazi shell that you might remember from PT Over the Gatewatch. No Ivugin, of course, anymore. No Simian Spirit Guide, which actually was a big part of these decks, allowing you to turbo out Chance of the Void on the first turn, or get that turn 2, turn 3 Thought-Knot Seer out there. But this is trying to play that same game still. So we have 4 Chalice of the Void in the main deck. So if you think that's a good card right now, maybe this is the home for it. Alongside 2 Gemstone Caverns. So that dream of turn 1 Chalice is not dead quite yet. And then 4 Serum Powder to tie the room together here. But I guess if you no longer have all of those different enablers for your nut draws, well, I guess you get to cheat the mulligan system even further and lean on Serum Powder plus a London Mulligan to make sure you have that that turn 2 Thought-Knot Seer or whatever it is more of the time.
Yeah, the things that I'm kind of sad about is that some of the true Eldrazi. So there's Eldrazi Obligator and Sky Spawner in this deck, but like I miss the Runation Guides and the Vile Aggregates. That's what I really want to see. Though there's Corrupted Crossroads in this deck and Shivan Reef, and I'm pretty sure those 2 cards are completely interchangeable in this deck, but it should be strictly better to have Shivan Reef because you can use the mana to cast things through Void Mirror, right?
I had not considered that, but yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. I was just like, oh, Corrupted Crossroads. Are we casting Bearer of Silence? Is that the Edict one? And the answer was no.
Yeah.
So
like Eldrazi Displacer back in the day. Corrupted Crossroads has real base camp vibes for it, where it's a bad dual land, even in the one deck in all of Magic that could conceivably support it.
Yeah, but at least this one's untapped.
Yeah, I again not sure why base camp had to come into play tapped in a set that had Omnath Locus of Creation in it. But I guess one of those cards is more powerful than the other. But one thing I do want to highlight about this deck is Warping Well. I think is actually a pretty fantastic card right now, where it deals with those premier 1-drop threats out of the red deck, so Ragavan and DRC and so on. But also, this card counters Bring to Light. It counters Crouching Footfalls and Living End. So usually, I'm only interested in that card when both of those modes have good common applications, but I think that does apply to the current moment. And I saw a green Tron deck, a blast from the past there, in one of the 5-0 League dumps, leaning on Warping Well, I think, to have that ability to actually participate in the game before the 3rd turn, which I think, if anything can bring that deck back, that ability is going to be crucial there.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. It also picks off a lot of the good Hammer Time targets, just giving you this is an all colorless deck. It's going to have some issues with instant speed removal against Hammer Time, and I like that.
Yeah, let's talk about the 3rd and final deck that you've picked out from this dump here. So we mentioned Timeless Dragon in jest a few times over this episode, and this is not 1, not 2, but 3 Timeless Dragons making their appearance here.
Yeah, this is a Smallpox deck looking to discard Timeless Dragon to Smallpox, presumably, which is kind of great, but this is a 5-creature Nether Spirit deck because Timeless Dragon eternalizes and gets out of your graveyard. I just loved that. There's a Turok. I don't think that the person could help themselves. That's just got to be a long-term Smallpox thing where it's oh, this card says Turok, it's him. I literally must play it. You know what? It's fine. That's your personal choice. You're allowed to do that. But if it was me, I would just have Timeless Dragons and Nether Spirits and just always be good. Though I guess you can Kaya your own Turok out of your graveyard and start preparing your Nether Spirit. Maybe you can just play more Nether Spirits. I'm kind of into that. Huh.
So until I saw this list, I had forgot, firstly, that Nether Spirit was a card that was legal in Modern, courtesy of the first Modern Horizons. And secondly, that it was Nether Spirit and not Nether Shadow, whichever the one is that if it's the only creature card in your graveyard, it comes back, as opposed to having a creature card above it.
Yeah, just to be clear, it's the only creature one is the one that's in Modern, not the one that would make Dredge utterly broken. You can also cling to dust and escape away the Turok so you can get back your Nether Spirit. So I actually think this deck should be playing three-ish Nether Spirits. I don't know the exact right number, but there's enough good ways to get them out of your own graveyard that I think you can afford to play more than one.
Yeah, it is very adorable. And we should talk about, I guess this would be the namesake card of the deck in Smallpox, which I want to say it was you, so correct me if I'm wrong, but this was one of the cards that was highlighted as, oh, this card might actually be really good in Modern right now. And the question is, well, where the hell do you put it then? Because unless you're Charlie the Banana King and you're playing 4-color, Ren and 6, Lurrus, Smallpox, and a bunch of other cards, you have to find a more on-the-rails place for that card. And so that's going to be, I guess, another kind of a black, disruptive mid-range deck. And once you accept those parameters, I guess this is maybe not an obvious conclusion, but at least a natural one.
Yeah, it's tough because so many of the best cards are 1-drop creatures, and like they're also 1-drop creatures that if you're on the play outrace a Smallpox in like significant ways. So it's tough to put a Smallpox into your deck, but this is getting closer. I do want to, there is some green mana in this deck because Indatha Triome makes it totally free. And there is a Toski Bearer of Secrets in the sideboard with your 4 Lingering Souls. So just a little chef kiss right there.
Yeah, I think the green splash here is ostensibly for the 2 copies of Crime Punishment, where the punishment half, where this is X, black, green, destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments with mana value X. So this is a Dissension banger from back in the day, which lines up well against both Urza Saga and its constructs. You play that for 2 mana, kill the Saga itself, kill the constructs. So I think that's the excuse to smuggle the green mana in there. And then once you do, you get to the main event here in the Toski.
Yeah. Just, I also, oh, wow, yeah, the Kaya's Gal token also. You just really have all the spirits to use.
I mean, I guess we need to, in theory, we might want to Prismatic Ending a 3-drop, right? So I guess we got to work a 3rd color in there, and then a Triome is a good way to do that. So, you know, we'll flip a coin between Survive Triome and Indatha Triome, and oh, look, we have green mana. I guess that the Toski is free at that point.
Yeah, I guess you can, oh, never mind. I was seeing if you could also Kaya's Guile the Turok out of your graveyard so you could set up a later Nether Spirit, but no, it does not target, which is probably good for the card, but sad for this exact use case.
That would be the actual like hidden mode achievement unlocked on that card, right? It already has 4 different modes, and you get to choose 2 of those at any given time, but this is like a hidden 4.5th mode where this is the one circumstance you would actually want to exile a card from your own graveyard.
Yeah. I see this whole thing is getting me thinking about Nether Spirit because, like, I guess it's hard for you to discard it on turn 1. So, like, you can't really line it up against Ragavan very well ever. But I want it to work.
I guess. So here's a philosophical question. Is Lingering Souls good or bad against Ragavan?
Terrible. I think it's terrible. I'm already skeptical of like Red and 6 against Ragavan because half the time it's too slow. I don't think you can. I'm closer to thinking Doom Traveler is good against or good enough for Modern even. So that's where I'm at these days.
I mean, I've been flirting with some Shambling Ghast decks. So this is the black 1-drop from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. It's a 1/1 zombie, and when it dies, you get your choice of Festering Goblin, so -1/-1 to something, potentially Ragavan, or you get to make a treasure token. And I'm interested in that second mode, but having that first one as insurance just to pick off, you know, one of these format-defining $100 marmosets is nice to have too.
Have you gone down the Liliana road with what's it called?
I have. So this is the M19 Liliana. It's Liliana Untouched by Death.
Untouched by Death.
Yeah. So this has a few different modes, but the ultimate, and I say that bearing in mind that you can just do this immediately. This is the final mode of this card, is you can cast zombie cards from your graveyard this turn. And there's no kind of York Must Will kind of clause, or there's no timing restriction where it's zombies that are there right now. So if you have a way to cast a zombie for free, then you just get to loop that zombie over and over. And so with Shambling Ghast, if you have a sacrifice outlet, whether it's something like Altar of Dementia, Goblin Bombardment for an immediate kill, or like a Carrion Feeder, which is a zombie you can buy back as a sacrifice outlet and then make infinitely large, you can loop the same Shambling Ghast over and over to make a treasure, sacrifice a treasure for black mana, recast the Shambling Ghast and over. And so that's infinite sacrificial fodder, essentially, for whatever your sac outlet is. And so it's like a 2.5 card combo of sorts where, you know, all of your cards at least do something. So that piques my interest. I actually have highest hopes for that in Historic just because of Phyrexian Tower, where, okay, yeah, there's less competition, but Tower allowing you to cast a 4-drop on turn 2 with the help of Shambling Ghast, where you sacrifice it to the Tower, so that's 2. Your other land that casts the Ghast on turn 1, that's 3, and then the treasure's 4. That gets you to turn 2 Liliana or, you know, Rankle or whatever you're spending 4 mana on in that format. Sadly, do not have that one over here, but you have more zombies to choose from, more good sacrifice outlets, and just more stuff to fill out a deck with. So I'm kind of intrigued by that. I know CFT Sock, who you'll remember from this podcast, from the ban Ether Vial Ephemerate deck, and also from other formats for various brews there. I know they took a look at this shell and was interested in refining it. So that one's on the docket. It's kind of looking at the back of the queue there.
Yeah, and I think that you're going to have to wait on trying that historic before you actually understand what of the 700 cards that they're adding to that format accidentally was a terrible idea.
There could be so many zombies in there.
There could be so many bad ideas. Just wait for Ragavan on it. They'll put Ragavan on MTG Arena and it'll cost 3 wild cards. That's just what's going to happen.
Well, you see, it's a mythic, and also it's in the historic horizons, so it's like a double mythic. But bearing in mind, in the context of this current arena economy discussion, when historic was first announced, that was the plan, was you would have to spend double wildcards just to get the equivalent of 1 wildcard in historic. And if you think the economy is egregiously structured or is price gouging you now, think back to if they had actually followed through on that and not given into the outcry there.
I believe the intent was to make it so that like people who bought into historic really wanted to buy in, but I think the actual outcome would have been that no one would want to buy in. So it would achieve its goal, just like technically.
Yeah, well, you see, historic is a place that lets you use your standard cards that have rotated out, and so when your Lovestruck beasts finally, after 2 years of faithful service, rotate out in September, I guess theoretically it's legal to put those in a historic deck.
It's been 2 years, not like 7.
I don't know anymore.
Yeah. It's I'm sure all the Okos will find it.
Yes. So I guess in closing here, if you had a modern tournament coming up this weekend, what would you play if you were trying to win? And also, what would you play if you were just trying to have a good time? And maybe there's the same answer to that question.
It's not very far apart. I think I'm with you. I think regardless, I would be trying to play some Ren Teferi deck. I think the question is whether I'd be playing Emrakul's or Dryads or Risen Reefs. And I don't know which one is where on the fun and win scale.
That's really the choice for me too. I feel like I have the most familiarity with the Bring to Light deck at this point. So maybe if I was short on time and was just trying to log something in, I'd go with that. But if I was trying to have a good time, and potentially if I was trying to win as well, I kind of like this Risen Reef deck. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, it feels fundamentally broken, but also like really good at being fair. Like that's really the whole thing about those Evoke elementals, right? That like they're very good at doing something sort of broken, but also very good at just being cast the fair way. And that's a pretty nice balance. It's also possible that enough people are thinking this way that you should just play a Blood Moon deck, in which case you should be playing as a Murktide.
Yeah, we mentioned the various insurance policies that the Bring to Light deck has against Blood Moon. Elementals, not so much. A lot harder to bob and weave around that card. And also a lot harder just to cast your spells sometimes, where, as we mentioned, you're a Cavern of Souls deck, 22 total lands, but also trying to support Utopia Sprawl, Ren and 6, Teferi, and so on. So not easy to juggle all of that at once. So I would need to check that this mana base actually functions, first of all, and maybe make some adjustments there. But yeah, if that's good to go, then maybe the rest of the deck is as well.
Yeah, I like the Force Negations as kind of, that's what Canister had kind of added to the sideboard that I don't think the Elementals decks necessarily had before. And that feels like a pretty good way to beat a Blood Moon. Like, if you board in a Force of Vigor against a random deck that might have Blood Moon, you feel like an idiot when they don't draw it. With Force Negation, you can at least get out of your investment in some reasonable way.
Yeah, I guess, like, what am I homing to hit against the Regent decks? Like, Expressive Iteration, maybe, I think is the best hit, but I'm still not thrilled about it.
Yeah, but it's better than nothing. I mean, both the cards are free, so you're going to be able to cast, like, it's going to work regardless. And, like, if you're in the state where you're like, oh, I don't have the Force, but I'll draw it before I die with your Blood Moon and play, that's not how that's going to work. They're just going to cast an 8/8 flyer the next turn. And, like, take your 5%er and throw it in the garbage. Just play a better card.
I do wonder if Blood Moon becomes a prevailing concern, depending on how the mana works out, like maybe there's some split of like actual Wismare that makes sense if you find yourself fetching basic planes often enough. Or I guess this is a majority green deck anyway, because you have Sprawl and Ren 6 and so on. So yeah, maybe you just want to stick with Foundation Breaker there.
Yeah, I was going to say that you would want the basic Force anyways, because that's what you're loading up the Sprawls on to avoid the Moon in the first place. And then from there, just Foundation Breaker is the easy pick.
it is nice that Harbinger still castable under Blood Moon to find the breaker to get you out of that bind.
Oh, that's actually pretty good. That might be enough.
Yeah, so I'm going to cross my fingers and tell myself that it is enough and probably end up registering that deck this weekend.
Okay, well, I wish you the best. I will probably play some of that in the meantime, so I might be able to provide some advanced advice, even if it is just don't do it.
Let me know if you have any verdict on that. And in the meantime, where can people be finding you?
I am at ARMLX on Twitter. I am on Star City Games, writing articles mostly Mondays, sometimes Tuesdays. It flips, schedules go each way, but typically talking about Modern. I might dip my toe into New Standard because I might actually have to see if I can function with all whatever is going on with that Jeskai Mutate deck. It took people like multiple months to like actually put what is going on in words. Like I read like between like, I don't know, have you tracked that deck at all? To get on the side.
I tried it last weekend and I managed to lose against aggro decks quickly enough that I never had time to think about, is the specific permutation of 4 cards an infinite combo or like a semi-infinite combo? The word deterministic didn't get a chance to work its way into the equation because Werewolf Pack Leader just, cracked my skull open. So I managed to dodge that, but not quite in the way that I had hoped for.
Yeah, I was like trying to find some resources about it because it looked kind of like the kind of thing that shouldn't exist in Standard, but might just be being held back by no one having a reason to go through all that effort on Arena. And Brad Nelson had tweeted like, this deck looks really good. And then tweet 2 of 2 is, I can't really explain how it works on Twitter. You just have to watch someone do it. I'm like, come on.
Yeah, and so his follow-up tweet was, these are the decks that I'm considering for this weekend, and it was, Naya Adventures and some other, more mainstream decks. And then Will Puttiam, who I think finished second in the 5K PTQ this weekend with the Mutate deck, said, why is Mutate not on this list, you coward? And then Brad said, I don't think the deck is very good, and I don't understand it. Followed up 20 minutes later by, okay, so if you're free this week, you can come on my stream and maybe talk me through this. And, so I think Brad got his way there in the end. If you are looking, and I use the royal you here, whether it's you or listeners out there, if you're looking for resources on the Mutate deck, I know Aya Karim Chandani, aka Hogpog, who you may recognize the screen name from various arena events, SCGs, and so on, has been streaming some of that deck and wrote a guide to it, so check that out. Tristan Wild LaRue, who, currently looking for excuses to play expressive iteration in any format, and often to a lot of success. One of the pioneers behind that deck wrote an extensive guide, which I think is public too, and there are some good resources out there. So, if you're looking to enlarge your brain enough that you can then wrap your brain around this deck, I think the stuff is out there for sure.
Yeah. And where can people find you when you're not here talking about unsubstantiating your own Goldspan Dragons?
Not talking about that anymore. I've had my fill of that. I've learned my lesson. But you can find me learning my lessons on Twitter at Dominaria, and I guess trying to impart lessons over on Star City Games, usually on Wednesdays or Fridays every week. But that's going to do it for us. So we'll be back in here next time with, I guess we don't know what our focus is going to be yet. We'll discuss that after we break here. But whatever it is, we'll be back with something this time next week. Take care, everyone.